The fog hung thick over Baker Street that November morning in 1892, creeping through the cobblestones like ghostly fingers searching for warmth. I had just finished my breakfast when Mrs. Hudson announced that Inspector Lestrade awaited us below, his manner suggesting urgency of the highest order. Holmes, who had been absorbed in his chemical apparatus for the better part of the morning, looked up with that familiar gleam in his grey eyes, the look of a hound catching the scent of worthy prey. "Ah, Watson," he said, setting down his test tube with careful precision. "Unless I am much mistaken, our friend from Scotland Yard brings news of something far more stimulating than the usual domestic murders and petty thefts that occupy his attention." Indeed, Lestrade's face bore the grim expression of a man confronted with circumstances beyond his conventional understanding. He declined Mrs. Hudson's offer of tea and launched immediately into his account. "Gentlemen, I have a most peculiar case that requires your particular expertise," he began, his voice betraying an uncharacteristic uncertainty. "Yesterday evening, one Ezekiel Thornfield, a clockmaker of considerable reputation, was found dead in his workshop on Whitmore Street. The circumstances are unusual." Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "Unusual in what manner, Inspector?" "The man was discovered by his daily cleaning woman, Mrs. Pemberton, when she arrived at 7 o'clock this morning. The workshop was locked from the inside, both the front entrance and the rear door leading to his private quarters above. The windows, too, were secured with their original latches, untouched. Yet Thornfield lay dead upon his workbench, and here is the strangest part." Lestrade paused, as if gathering courage for what he was about to reveal. "Yes?" Holmes prompted, his interest clearly piqued. "Every timepiece in the workshop, and there were dozens of them, Mr. Holmes, clocks of every description, had stopped at precisely 17 minutes past 2 o'clock. The silence that followed was broken only by the steady tick of our own mantelpiece clock." Holmes's eyes narrowed, and I could see his mind already working through the implications. "Most intriguing," he murmured. "And the cause of death?" "That's just it. There's no obvious cause. No wounds, no signs of violence, no indication of poison. The man simply appears to have expired. Dr. Bradshaw examined the body and pronounced it a case of sudden heart failure. But given the circumstances—" "Quite right to be suspicious," Holmes said, rising from his chair with sudden energy. "Watson, your coat. Inspector, we shall accompany you to Whitmore Street immediately. But first tell me, was anything disturbed in the workshop? Anything missing?" Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. "Well, there's the matter of the will. According to Mr. Hartwell, Thornfield's solicitor, the deceased left specific instructions that upon his death, a locked iron box was to be delivered immediately to the Ministry of War. This box was supposedly kept in his workshop, but we've found no trace of it." "The Ministry of War?" I interjected. "What possible business could a clockmaker have with military affairs?" "That, my dear Watson, is precisely what we must discover," Holmes replied, already donning his overcoat. "Inspector, I trust the scene remains undisturbed?" "I've posted a constable at the door since yesterday evening. Nothing has been touched." The journey to Whitmore Street took us through the heart of London's craftsman quarter, where narrow streets wound between workshops and modest dwellings. The fog seemed to thicken as we progressed, muffling the sounds of the city and lending an air of mystery to our expedition. Thornfield's establishment occupied the ground floor of a 3-story building, its windows dark and forbidding. The constable on duty, a young man named Bradshaw, saluted Lestrade respectfully and unlocked the heavy oak door. The moment we stepped inside, I was struck by an overwhelming sense of stillness. Not merely the absence of sound, but something deeper, as if time itself had been suspended within these walls. The workshop was a marvel of organized precision. Workbenches lined the walls, each equipped with the finest tools of the clockmaker's trade. Gears, springs, and delicate mechanisms lay arranged in careful rows, while completed timepieces occupied shelves and display cases throughout the room. Yet every single clock face bore the same haunting testimony, hands frozen at 2:17. Holmes moved through the space with the careful deliberation of a cat stalking its prey, his keen eyes noting every detail. I followed, taking in the scene while marveling at the sheer number of timepieces. There were grandfather clocks of imposing stature, delicate mantel clocks with intricate wooden cases, pocket watches gleaming in their display cases, and several mechanical marvels I could not readily identify. "Observe, Watson," Holmes said, pausing before the central workbench where a white cloth covered what I assumed to be the unfortunate Thornfield. "The position of the body." He drew back the cloth, revealing a man of perhaps 60 years, thin and wiry, with the long, nimble fingers characteristic of his trade. Thornfield lay upon his back across the workbench, his arms at his sides, his face bearing an expression of mild surprise rather than pain or terror. "No signs of struggle," I observed, examining the body with my medical eye. "His clothing is undisturbed, and I see no obvious trauma." "Indeed. Yet observe his right hand. There, Watson. Do you see the faint staining upon his fingers?" I leaned closer and noted the subtle discoloration Holmes had detected. "Some form of chemical residue?" "Most likely. And here," Holmes pointed to a small brass gear that lay beside the body. "This was clutched in his left hand when he was discovered. Inspector, was this detail mentioned in your report?" Lestrade consulted his notebook. "Yes, Mrs. Pemberton noted it specifically, said it was most unusual as Mr. Thornfield was particular about keeping his work surfaces clean." Holmes lifted the gear with his handkerchief, examining it closely. "Extraordinary. This is no ordinary clock component, Watson. Observe the unusual teeth configuration and the minute inscriptions along the rim." I squinted at the tiny markings. "They appear to be letters? Or perhaps numbers? A code, unless I'm much mistaken. But of what nature?" Holmes pocketed the gear carefully. "Now let us examine the timepieces themselves. Inspector, you mentioned that all stopped at 2:17. "Every one, Mr. Holmes. We've checked them all." Holmes began a systematic examination of the nearest clocks, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to the naked eye. "Fascinating. These mechanisms show no signs of interference, no broken springs, no jammed gears. Yet they have all ceased function at the identical moment." "Is such a thing possible?" I asked. "Under normal circumstances, highly improbable. However, if one were to create a mechanism capable of generating a specific type of electromagnetic disturbance..." Holmes trailed off, his attention caught by something on the far wall. There, partially concealed behind a large grandfather clock, was a section of the wall that appeared different from the rest. Holmes moved the timepiece aside, revealing a small safe built into the wall itself. The iron door hung open, its contents gone. "Well, well," he murmured. "Our mysterious box, I presume. Inspector, was this safe discovered in your initial investigation?" Lestrade's face reddened. "The clock was positioned directly in front of it. We had no reason to move it." "No matter. The question now becomes, who knew of its existence and contents?" Holmes examined the safe carefully. "The lock shows no signs of forced entry. Whoever opened this had either the combination or the key." As he spoke, we heard footsteps on the stairs leading to the upper floors. A moment later, a young woman appeared in the doorway, tall, dark-haired, with the kind of striking features that suggested both intelligence and determination. Her clothing was mourning attire of good quality, though I noted the slight fraying at the cuffs that spoke of genteel poverty. "I am Margaret Thornfield," she announced, her voice steady despite the evident strain. "I've come to collect my father's personal effects." The tension in the room was palpable. Lestrade stepped forward officiously. "Miss Thornfield, I'm afraid this is still an active investigation. Nothing can be removed at present." Her grey eyes, so like Holmes's in their intensity, fixed upon the inspector with barely concealed disdain. "My father is dead, Inspector. Surely I have the right to—" "You have the right to nothing," a harsh voice interrupted from the doorway. A man entered, perhaps 30 years of age, with the calloused hands and leather apron of a craftsman. His face bore the kind of bitter expression that spoke of long-held grievances. "She gave up any claim to this place years ago." "Thomas Wickham, I presume," Holmes interjected smoothly. "Mr. Thornfield's apprentice?" "Former apprentice," the man corrected. "Though I've worked in this shop for 7 years, making it what it is today, more than can be said for his so-called daughter." Margaret Thornfield's composure cracked slightly. Father and I may have had our differences, but— Differences? Wickham laughed bitterly. You mean your complete rejection of everything he stood for? Your refusal to learn the trade? Your marriage to that fortune-hunting wastrel against his express wishes? Gentlemen, please, Holmes said, his voice cutting through the growing animosity. We are here to investigate a death, not to referee family disputes. Miss Thornfield, when did you last see your father? She composed herself with visible effort. 3 weeks ago. I came to attempt a reconciliation. He refused to see me. And you, Mr. Wickham? Yesterday evening, as always. I left at 6 o'clock, locked the workshop and gave him the key. Same as every day for the past 7 years. Who else had access to the premises? Only Mrs. Pemberton, the cleaning woman, and— Wickham hesitated. Yes? There was a gentleman who'd been visiting recently, foreign fellow, very interested in Father Thornfield's work, called himself Professor Moravec, claimed to be writing a book about English clockmaking. Holmes and I exchanged glances. Describe this man. Medium height, dark beard, spoke with some kind of accent, German perhaps, or Eastern European. Always carried a leather satchel and took notes constantly. When was his last visit? 2 days ago. He seemed particularly interested in the older pieces, the ones with military connections. Military connections? Holmes's voice sharpened. Margaret Thornfield looked surprised. You didn't know? Father did considerable work for the War Office during the Crimean conflict. Timing mechanisms for artillery, precision instruments for reconnaissance. He was quite proud of his contributions to the war effort. Indeed, Holmes turned to Wickham. Were you aware of this aspect of your master's work? The apprentice's expression grew guarded. He rarely spoke of it, said it was better forgotten. Yet he kept examples of his military work? Some. There were pieces in the workshop that he never sold, never displayed, kept them in the safe there. He gestured toward the empty cavity in the wall. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Most illuminating. Now I must ask you both. Where were you yesterday evening between the hours of 2 and 3 in the morning? Margaret answered first. At home with my husband. We live in Bloomsbury. Wickham shifted uncomfortably. I was at the public house on Drury Lane, the Rose and Crown. You can ask the proprietor. I was there until closing. And after closing, I walked home to my lodgings, alone. Holmes made a note in his pocketbook. Very well. For now, I must ask you both to remain available for further questioning. Inspector Lestrade will provide you with the necessary details. As the two departed, Margaret with dignified sorrow, Wickham with obvious resentment, Holmes continued his examination of the workshop. He spent considerable time studying the stopped clocks, making notes and measurements that seemed to follow some pattern visible only to him. What do you make of it, Holmes? I asked as we prepared to leave. A most complex puzzle, Watson. We have a locked room death with no apparent cause, a missing military artifact, 2 suspects with clear motives, and a mysterious foreign visitor. Add to this the curious matter of the synchronized timepieces and the coded gear, and we have a case that promises to test even our combined abilities. As we stepped back into the fog-shrouded street, Holmes paused at the doorway. Tell me, Watson, what was your impression of Miss Thornfield? Grieving, certainly. But there was something else, a sense that she was holding back information. Precisely my own observation. And young Wickham, bitter, resentful, the type who might well harbor violent thoughts toward his master. Indeed. Yet neither explains the central mystery. How does one stop every clock in a room at precisely the same moment? And why 2:17? As we climbed into the waiting hansom, Holmes fell into one of his characteristic silences, his fingers drumming against his knee in a rhythm that seemed to echo the ticking of the clocks we had left behind. The fog swirled around us as we returned to Baker Street, carrying with it the sense that we had only glimpsed the surface of a mystery far more complex and dangerous than any of us yet realized. The game, as Holmes would say, was afoot, but this time it seemed that time itself might be our adversary. The remainder of that day found Holmes in a state of intense concentration that I had seldom witnessed, even in our most challenging cases. He had spread the contents of his chemical laboratory across our sitting-room table, alongside detailed sketches of the workshop and the mysterious gear we had discovered. The fog outside had thickened to an almost impenetrable wall, as if London itself conspired to shroud our investigation in mystery. "Watson," he said suddenly, looking up from his microscope, "what do you know of electromagnetic theory?" I confessed my knowledge to be rudimentary at best, confined to what I had learned of medical applications during my studies. "Then allow me to illuminate you. The work of Faraday and Maxwell has shown us that electromagnetic fields can affect metallic objects at a distance. In theory, a sufficiently powerful electromagnetic pulse could indeed stop multiple timepieces simultaneously, if they were specifically designed to be susceptible to such interference." "You believe Thornfield's clocks were deliberately constructed to be vulnerable?" "More than that, Watson. I believe they were constructed to be controlled." Holmes lifted the brass gear with his tweezers, holding it beneath the lamp. "The chemical residue on Thornfield's fingers proves most revealing. It contains traces of a rare metallic compound, one used in the construction of precision electromagnetic devices." Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor. To my surprise, it was Miss Margaret Thornfield, though her appearance had changed considerably since our morning encounter. Gone was the composed morning attire. Instead, she wore a practical dark dress and carried a leather satchel that seemed incongruously professional for a woman of her station. "Mr. Holmes," she began without preamble, "I have not been entirely truthful with you." Holmes gestured for her to sit, his expression betraying neither surprise nor judgment. "I confess, Miss Thornfield, that I suspected as much. Pray, enlighten us." She drew a deep breath. "My father and I were not estranged due to family disputes. We quarreled because I discovered the true nature of his work and the danger it represented." "Go on." 3 years ago I returned from Switzerland, where I had been studying advanced mathematics and engineering. She paused, noting my expression. "Yes, Dr. Watson, such education is unusual for a woman, but my father insisted upon it. He said that someday I would need to understand his work." Holmes leaned forward. "And what was the nature of this work?" "He called it the Kronos Project. During the Crimean War, the military commissioned him to develop timing mechanisms for coordinated artillery strikes. But father became obsessed with the concept of time itself as a weapon. He theorized that if one could control the perception of time, one could control the outcome of battles." "Perception of time," I interjected. "Imagine, Doctor, if you could slow the reflexes of enemy soldiers or accelerate the thinking of your own forces." Father believed he had discovered a way to use precisely calibrated electromagnetic pulses to affect the human nervous system, to literally change how the brain processes temporal information. Holmes's eyes gleamed with understanding. The stopped clocks. They were not the target. They were the proof of concept. Exactly. Father designed those timepieces to be exquisitely sensitive to his electromagnetic device. When activated, it would demonstrate the field's power by stopping every clock simultaneously, but the real target was human consciousness itself. "And this device, it was contained in the missing box?" Margaret nodded gravely. "The Kronos engine," he called it, a device no larger than a music box, but capable of generating electromagnetic fields of unprecedented precision. In the wrong hands, it could be used to incapacitate entire armies or populations. "Why come to us now?" Holmes asked. "Why not earlier?" "Because I hoped the secret had died with him. I thought perhaps he had destroyed the device, abandoned the project, but when I learned of the missing box, I realized that someone else knew of its existence." "Professor Moravec?" "I believe so. The man Wickham described matches the appearance of a Prussian agent my father once mentioned, a man who had been seeking information about British military innovations." Holmes rose and began pacing, his mind clearly working through the implications. "Miss Thornfield, I must ask you directly, did you visit your father's workshop yesterday evening?" She met his gaze steadily. "I did. I arrived at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning, using a spare key father had given me years ago. I hoped to find and destroy the Kronos engine before anyone else could claim it." "And did you find it?" "The safe was already open, the box gone. Father lay dead upon his workbench. though at the time I thought he had simply collapsed from exhaustion. The clocks were still running then. I remember hearing them ticking in the darkness. Then you witnessed the moment they stopped? Yes. At precisely 2:17 there was a strange humming sound, barely audible, and then silence. Complete silence. I realized then that someone had activated the device. Holmes stopped pacing abruptly. You said the device was no larger than a music box. Could it have been operated remotely? Father's notes suggested it could be triggered by a secondary mechanism, a timer perhaps, or a telegraph signal, but the range would be limited to perhaps a few hundred yards. Then our murderer was nearby when the device activated. Holmes turned to me. Watson, we must examine the surrounding buildings. Someone was watching that workshop, waiting for the precise moment to demonstrate the engine's power. Before we could act on this revelation, Mrs. Hudson once again announced a visitor. This time it was Inspector Lestrade, and his agitation was evident from the moment he entered. Mr. Holmes, we have a development. Thomas Wickham has been found dead in his lodgings. Margaret gasped, her face draining of colour. Holmes, however, seemed almost to have expected this news. Circumstances? He asked tersely. Apparent suicide by poison. Left a note confessing to his master's murder. Lestrade produced a folded paper. Claims he killed Thornfield in a rage over being excluded from the old man's will, then took his own life in remorse. Holmes examined the note with his magnifying glass. Interesting. Miss Thornfield, is this Wickham's handwriting? She studied the paper carefully. It appears to be. Thomas always had a distinctive style, those elaborate flourishes on his capital letters. Indeed. Yet observe, Watson. Holmes pointed to several words in the confession. The pressure of the pen varies significantly throughout the document. Some words are written with a heavy hand, others barely legible. What does this suggest? I considered the question. Perhaps he was in an agitated state while writing. Possibly. Or perhaps someone was guiding his hand. Holmes folded the note carefully. Inspector, I trust the body remains undisturbed? Dr. Bradshaw is examining it now. But surely this confession resolves the matter. On the contrary, it deepens the mystery considerably. Miss Thornfield, did Wickham have any knowledge of your father's military work? Limited knowledge. Father was careful to keep the more sensitive aspects of his work secret. But Thomas was skilled with mechanisms. He might have been able to operate the device if he had found it. Yet if Wickham had possession of the Kronos engine, why would he kill himself? Such a device would be worth a fortune to the right buyer. Holmes began gathering his coat and hat. Gentlemen, we must examine Wickham's lodgings immediately. And, Miss Thornfield, I must ask you to accompany us. Your expertise may prove invaluable. The journey to Wickham's modest rooms in Clerkenwell took us through increasingly narrow and grimy streets. The fog seemed to press against us, with almost physical weight, muffling the sounds of the city and creating an atmosphere of mounting dread. Wickham's lodgings occupied the second floor of a decrepit building, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked ominously under our weight. The door had been forced by the police, and Constable Bradshaw stood guard outside. Been dead several hours, he reported to Lestrade. Landlady found him when she came to collect the rent. Nasty business. The room was spartanly furnished, a narrow bed, a wooden table, a single chair, and a small fireplace. Wickham lay slumped over the table, his face bearing the distinctive bluish tinge of cyanide poisoning. Beside him stood a small vial, its contents nearly exhausted. Holmes immediately began his examination, starting with the suicide note. Watson, observe the ink. Notice how it changes colour slightly in the middle paragraphs. I leaned closer. The later portions appear slightly darker, suggesting the use of a different pen or perhaps a different hand altogether. Holmes turned his attention to the room itself, studying every surface with meticulous care. Ah, what have we here? In the fireplace, among the cold ashes, he discovered several partially burned papers. Working carefully with his tweezers, he extracted what remained of the documents. Fascinating, he murmured, piecing together the fragments. These appear to be technical drawings, gear configurations, spring mechanisms. Miss Thornfield, do these relate to your father's work? She examined the remnants closely. Yes, but these are not father's drawings. The style is different, cruder. Thomas must have been attempting to recreate some of the mechanisms, or perhaps someone wanted us to believe he was. Holmes continued his search, eventually discovering a loose floorboard beneath the bed. Hidden in the space below was a small leather journal, its pages filled with Wickham's handwriting. "Listen to this," Holmes said, reading from the journal. "The old man grows more secretive each day. He speaks of great things, of changing the world, but tells me nothing. I have served him faithfully for 7 years, yet he treats me as a mere apprentice. If he will not share his secrets willingly, perhaps I must discover them myself." "That sounds like Thomas," Margaret said quietly. "He was always resentful of being excluded from father's confidence." Holmes continued reading. "I have been watching the workshop at night. Strange visitors come and go. The foreign professor seems particularly interested in the old military pieces. There is something here, something valuable, and I mean to have my share." "The final entry is most illuminating," Holmes announced. "Tomorrow I will confront the old man. If he will not acknowledge my contributions, perhaps it is time to seek other employment. The professor has made certain suggestions. Perhaps it is time to consider them." "Professor Moravec again," I observed. "It seems he was attempting to recruit Wickham as an informant." "Or as something more," Holmes replied grimly. "Miss Thornfield, in your father's notes, was there any mention of a fail-safe mechanism, something that would activate if the device were tampered with?" She thought carefully. Father was paranoid about security. He mentioned once that the Kronos engine was designed to eliminate anyone who attempted to operate it without proper authorization. Eliminate how? The electromagnetic pulse, if improperly calibrated, could cause fatal disruption to the human nervous system. In effect, the device would kill its operator. Holmes nodded slowly. "Then we begin to see the shape of our mystery. Wickham, possibly in league with Moravec, attempted to steal the Kronos engine. When they activated it, whether by accident or design, the device killed Thornfield instantly, stopping his heart at precisely 2:17. But the electromagnetic pulse also affected Wickham, though not fatally. Perhaps he was at a greater distance, or perhaps the device's power was already diminishing." "But why kill Wickham afterward?" I asked. "Because he had served his purpose. Moravec needed someone with access to the workshop and knowledge of its routines. Once the device was in his possession, Wickham became a liability, a witness who could identify him. Then the confession, undoubtedly forged, at least in part. Moravec forced Wickham to write certain portions, then completed it himself after administering the poison." Margaret Thornfield had grown increasingly pale during this discussion. "Mr. Holmes, if this Moravec person has the Kronos engine, what does he intend to do with it? That, Miss Thornfield, is the question that may determine the fate of nations. A device capable of incapacitating entire armies would be of immense value to any foreign power. But first we must prove our theory." Holmes began a systematic search of the room, paying particular attention to areas where someone might have hidden while waiting for Wickham to return. Behind a loose brick in the wall, he discovered a small piece of paper, a fragment that had apparently been torn from a larger document. "German," he announced, examining the text. "Technical specifications for electromagnetic field generation. Our Professor Moravec becomes more interesting by the moment." As we prepared to leave Wickham's lodgings, Holmes paused at the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded streets below. "Watson, we are dealing with more than simple murder and theft. If the Kronos engine is as powerful as Miss Thornfield suggests, it represents a threat to the very balance of power in Europe. What do you propose we do?" "We must find Moravec before he can deliver the device to his employers, and we must do so quickly. A man who would kill twice to obtain such a weapon will not hesitate to kill again to keep it." As we descended the creaking stairs, I could not shake the feeling that we were being watched. The fog seemed to press closer, and every shadow might conceal an enemy. Time, which had seemed so malleable in Thornfield's workshop, now pressed upon us with urgent weight. The game had indeed become afoot, but the stakes were higher than any we had previously encountered. Somewhere in the labyrinthine streets of London, a foreign agent possessed a weapon that could change the course of history itself, and we had perhaps hours to prevent its deployment. Holmes quickened his pace, his mind already working through the complexities of the chase ahead. Behind us, the fog swallowed Wickham's lodgings, leaving only the memory of a man who had paid the ultimate price for his ambition and greed. The hunt for Professor Moravec was about to begin. The fog had lifted by dawn, revealing a London transformed by the pale winter light. Holmes had spent the night in fevered activity, sending telegrams across the city and consulting his extensive network of informants. By the time I descended for breakfast, our sitting room resembled a military command post, with maps of London spread across every available surface and cryptic notes pinned to the walls. "Ah, Watson," Holmes greeted me without looking up from his correspondence. "I trust you slept better than I did. We have much work ahead of us. Any progress on locating Professor Moravec?" "Considerable progress, though the picture that emerges is more troubling than I had anticipated." Holmes handed me a telegram. "This arrived an hour ago from my contact at the German embassy. There is no Professor Moravec listed among their cultural attachés, nor any record of a scholarly exchange program involving clockmaking. Then he is operating under false credentials." "Undoubtedly, but this telegram from Inspector Bradshaw at the Thames River Police is more illuminating." He passed me a second message. "A body was discovered this morning floating near London Bridge. A man matching Moravec's description, bearing papers identifying him as Klaus Zimmermann, an agent of the Prussian intelligence service." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "If Moravec is dead, then who has the Kronos engine?" "That, my dear Watson, is the question that has kept me awake all night, and I fear the answer is more complex than we initially supposed." Before I could respond, Miss Thornfield arrived, her face bearing the strain of a sleepless night. She carried with her a worn leather portfolio that she placed upon our table with evident reluctance. "Mr. Holmes, I have brought my father's private notes, everything relating to the Kronos project. I had hoped never to share these with anyone, but circumstances have made concealment impossible." Holmes examined the documents with intense concentration, occasionally making notes or cross-referencing details with his maps. After nearly an hour of study, he looked up with an expression I had rarely seen, one of genuine concern mixed with admiration. "Miss Thornfield, your father was a genius of the highest order. These calculations, this theoretical framework, it represents decades of revolutionary work. But I must ask you directly, are you certain there was only one Kronos engine?" She hesitated. "Father's notes mention the possibility of creating multiple devices, each calibrated for specific electromagnetic frequencies. Why do you ask?" "Because the events of the past 2 days suggest we are dealing with at least 2 parties, each possessing intimate knowledge of your father's work." Holmes stood and began pacing. "Consider, Moravec or Zimmermann was certainly attempting to steal the device, but his death suggests that he was not the only interested party. You believe there were competing agents? More than that. I believe your father anticipated this situation and took precautions we have not yet discovered." Holmes returned to the notes, pointing to a specific passage. "Here, should the primary security fail, the secondary protocol will ensure the device cannot be misused." What did he mean by secondary protocol? Margaret studied her father's handwriting carefully. "I'm not certain. Father was always cryptic about his security measures, but there are references here to something called the Temporal Guardian, a companion device designed to neutralize the Kronos engine if necessary. A fail-safe mechanism? More than that, a hunter. Father believed that if the Kronos engine were ever stolen, the Guardian would be activated automatically, seeking out the stolen device and rendering it inoperable." Holmes's eyes gleamed with understanding. "Then perhaps our mysterious third party is not a foreign agent at all, but rather your father's own creation. Miss Thornfield, according to these notes, where would such a Guardian device be housed?" She traced her finger along a complex diagram. "The calculations suggest it would need to be positioned at a specific distance from the workshop, close enough to monitor the primary device, but far enough to avoid being affected by its electromagnetic field. Perhaps 300 yards. Holmes strode to his map of London, using a compass to draw a circle around Thornfield's workshop. Within this radius, we have several possibilities: the Church of St. Bartholomew, the Whitmore Street Postal Station, and, his finger stopped at a particular building, the Royal Observatory's secondary facility. The observatory, I asked, established 15 years ago as a backup facility for precision timekeeping. It would be the perfect location for monitoring electromagnetic disturbances affecting chronometric devices. Holmes gathered his coat. We must investigate immediately. The journey to the observatory facility took us through streets still glistening with morning dampness. The building itself was modest, a 3-story brick structure with a distinctive astronomical dome. As we approached, I noticed something unusual about the windows on the upper floors. They had been fitted with what appeared to be metallic mesh. Electromagnetic shielding, Margaret observed. Father used similar materials in his workshop. Holmes examined the building's entrance carefully. Curious. The lock has been recently forced, yet there are no signs of official investigation. Someone has been here ahead of us. The interior of the facility was a marvel of precision instruments, telescopes, chronometers, and devices whose purpose I could not readily identify, but it was the basement that held our attention. There, in a room lined with copper mesh, stood a device that was unmistakably the twin of the missing Chronos engine. "The Temporal Guardian," Margaret whispered. "Father actually built it." Holmes approached the device cautiously. It was indeed similar to his descriptions of the Chronos engine, but larger and more complex. A series of dials and gauges suggested it was capable of not merely generating electromagnetic pulses, but of detecting and countering them as well. "Observe the control panel," Holmes said. "These indicators suggest the device has been active recently. In fact, it appears to be tracking something." A small screen displayed what looked like a map of London, with a pulsing dot moving slowly through the streets. As we watched, the dot appeared to be heading toward the Thames. "The stolen Chronos engine," I breathed. "It's being tracked automatically." "More than tracked," Holmes replied grimly. "If Miss Thornfield's interpretation is correct, this Guardian device is programmed to neutralize the stolen unit. But such neutralization might well be fatal to anyone in close proximity." "We must follow that signal," Margaret said urgently. "If the device activates in a populated area..." Holmes was already studying the tracking display. "The signal is moving toward the docks. Watson, we must alert the river police immediately. If someone is attempting to smuggle the Chronos engine out of the country, they will likely use the Thames." As we prepared to leave, Holmes paused at the Guardian device's control panel. "Miss Thornfield, is there any way to communicate with this machine? To override its programming?" She examined the controls carefully. "There appears to be a manual override, but it requires a specific code sequence. Father's notes might contain the information, but we have no time to decipher them," Holmes concluded. "Very well. We must trust that your father's genius extended to ensuring innocent lives would not be endangered." The race to the Thames took us through the heart of London's commercial district. Holmes had dispatched telegrams to Inspector Lestrade and the river police, but the fog was beginning to return, making visibility increasingly treacherous. We reached the docks just as the afternoon light began to fade. The vast network of wharves and warehouses stretched along the river like a maze of shadows and mist. Holmes consulted his pocket watch, a gesture that had taken on new significance given recent events. "According to the Guardian's tracking, the signal should be strongest near Pier 47, he announced. As we made our way through the labyrinthine dock complex, I became aware of an odd humming sound, barely audible but growing steadily stronger. Margaret noticed it too, her face growing pale with recognition. "The Chronos engine," she whispered. "It's been activated." "But surely that means..." I began, then stopped as the implications became clear. If the device was active and if the Guardian was programmed to neutralize it, "Everyone within 300 yards is in mortal danger," Holmes finished grimly. "Watson, we must clear the area immediately." But even as he spoke, we saw them, a group of figures moving through the fog near the water's edge. At their center was a man carrying what appeared to be a small wooden box, and the humming sound was emanating directly from his position. "That's not Moravec," Margaret observed. but I recognized the man beside him. That's Dr. Pemberton, father's physician. But what is he doing here? Holmes's expression darkened with understanding. Dr. Pemberton was the one who examined your father's body and pronounced the cause of death as heart failure. He would have had access to the workshop, opportunity to discover the safe, and medical knowledge sufficient to forge a convincing suicide. But why would father's own physician betray him? Perhaps we should ask him directly, Holmes replied, stepping forward into the open. The group of men froze as we approached. Dr. Pemberton, a distinguished gentleman in his 60s, turned toward us with an expression of resigned determination. "Mr. Holmes," he said calmly, "I wondered when you would piece together the truth. Dr. Pemberton, I confess you have surprised me. I had not suspected Ezekiel Thornfield's trusted physician of being involved in his murder." "Murder?" Pemberton laughed bitterly. "I did not murder Ezekiel Thornfield, Mr. Holmes. I was trying to save him from himself." "Explain." "Ezekiel came to me 3 weeks ago, dying of a rare heart condition. He had perhaps days to live, and he knew it. But rather than accept his fate, he became obsessed with completing his infernal machine. He intended to demonstrate the Kronos engine to government officials to sell it to the highest bidder." "And you objected to this plan?" "I objected to unleashing such horror upon the world. Do you understand what that device can do? It doesn't simply stop clocks, Mr. Holmes. In the wrong hands, it could stop human hearts across entire battlefields. Ezekiel was dying, but his creation would live on to kill thousands." Margaret stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "Dr. Pemberton, what did you do?" "I attempted to reason with him. When that failed, I tried to steal the device myself, to destroy it. But Ezekiel caught me in the act. We struggled, and in the confusion the device activated. The electromagnetic pulse killed him instantly, and very nearly killed me as well." "Yet you took the device," Holmes observed. "To destroy it, yes. But I discovered I could not simply smash such a sophisticated mechanism. It required specific expertise." "So you enlisted the aid of foreign agents?" Pemberton's face flushed with anger. "Not foreign agents, British patriots. These men work for a secret department of the Foreign Office dedicated to preventing such weapons from falling into enemy hands. We planned to dispose of the device safely at sea." But even as he spoke, the humming from the wooden box grew louder, and I noticed that several of the men around us had begun to stagger, their faces taking on the bluish pallor I had seen in Wickham's lodgings. "The Guardian!" Margaret cried. "It's found the stolen device." The air around us began to shimmer with an almost visible energy, and I felt a strange disorientation, as if time itself were becoming unstable. The fog swirled in impossible patterns, and the sound of the Thames seemed to slow and distort. Holmes acted with decisive speed. "Miss Thornfield, the override code. We must shut down both devices immediately." She was already fumbling with her father's notes, her hands shaking as she tried to read in the dim light. "Here, the sequence is based on the time of father's death. 217 repeated 3 times. The man holding the Kronos engine had collapsed, the device still humming ominously in its box. Holmes lunged forward, seizing the mechanism and examining its controls. There, a series of numbered dials that could be adjusted. 217, he muttered, setting the first sequence. 217, 217. The humming stopped so abruptly that the silence seemed almost tangible. Around us, the men who had been affected by the electromagnetic field began to recover, though several still required medical attention. Dr. Pemberton looked at Holmes with a mixture of gratitude and despair. "You have saved their lives, Mr. Holmes. But you have also preserved a weapon that should never have been created." "Perhaps," Holmes replied, carefully closing the wooden box. "But that decision is not ours to make. The device will be turned over to the proper authorities, who will determine its fate." As Inspector Lestrade and his men arrived to take the survivors into custody, I reflected on the extraordinary case we had just concluded. A clockmaker's obsession with time had nearly created a weapon capable of stopping time itself, and stopping the hearts of those who opposed it. Margaret Thornfield stood beside the Thames, watching the fog roll across the water. "What will become of father's work?" she asked quietly. "That remains to be seen," Holmes replied, "but I suspect the world is not yet ready for such power. Perhaps it never will be. As we returned to Baker Street through the gaslit streets of London, I found myself checking my pocket watch repeatedly, a habit that would persist for weeks to come. The case of the clockmaker's secret had been solved, but it had taught us that time itself could be weaponized, that the very heartbeat of existence could be controlled by those with sufficient knowledge and ruthless ambition. The stopped clocks in Thornfield's workshop had told a story more complex than any of us had initially imagined. They spoke not merely of murder and theft, but of the dangerous intersection between scientific genius and human frailty, between the desire to protect and the need to destroy. Holmes had preserved both the Kronos engine and its guardian counterpart, ensuring they would be secured by government officials with the wisdom to understand their implications. Dr. Pemberton, despite his misguided methods, had acted from genuine concern for humanity's welfare, and Margaret Thornfield had proven herself worthy of her father's intellectual legacy, if not his moral blindness. As for the precise time of 2:17, it had been both Ezekiel Thornfield's moment of death and his final message to the world. For in those numbers lay the combination that could stop his greatest creation, a failsafe built into the very heart of the device that had cost him his life. Time, we had learned, was indeed the ultimate mystery, one that even Sherlock Holmes approached with humility and respect. The case was closed, but its implications would resonate far beyond our small corner of Victorian London, into a future where the manipulation of time itself might determine the fate of nations. The game was afoot no longer, but the questions it had raised would continue to tick away in our minds, like the countless timepieces that marked humanity's passage through the endless mystery of existence itself.